I want you to hear this. I was eavesdropping on the admissions committees for the master's degree candidates. Be quiet. At Princeton. So all the students, they Skype in, and Stan, Alan, and Michael Meredith interview them, and they say, "Why do you want to come to Princeton?" And this one, I don't know who he was. Maybe he was a SCI-Arc student. He said, "Huh?" Because it's free. And so the student, they said, "I really want to understand what this architectural discourse is. I really don't understand it. I never knew it was so hard." And they said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I was watching Eric Moss and Jeff Kipnis online. They had this conversation, and I didn't understand a word of it. And I want to go to Princeton and learn how to understand this stuff." That'll solve it. I think that's really, I know, it's very funny.
He said he understood me, but not you. Send a message to that kid right now.
What I really wonder is if he's a student from here and he's trying to figure out how to answer this. Anyway, so we've done three topics: construction, personal and philosophies, intuitions and how to instrumentalize them. And the last topic is history. History meaning the intellectual environment we're inscribed in. We live in a historic consciousness. History in terms of how to make history. Are we part of history? Anyway, I'm not going to screw it up. I'm going to respond to I'm going to let him do the introduction, and so here's Eric.
Nice job.
Shorter.
This is actually one of the great things about SCI-Arc, that we can set up a venue like this and talk about a subject like this and invent its meaning and try to understand it. So I wouldn't want to claim this is a talk, and you see some of these where somebody gives the same talk in 50 places or 50 times. It's not that kind of thing, and it should be understood in an investigatory spirit. This is the guy without history, so you have that to look forward to. This is a painting by Courbet, mid-19th century. And to try to talk about what I'm going to attempt to talk about, the question, I think the way Kipnis and I set it up was the topic is, what's history? And in a more conventional sense, history we know and use as a point of reference in architecture, and more broadly as a point of reference to explain or to attempt to explain what we think is going on in the world and why, and what antecedents it has, and so on, with a presumption that what is behind us has some consequence in terms of what follows us. That's the supposition. But this is not an attempt to. The Princeton guys and the guy who watched got it completely wrong, 100% wrong. This is not an attempt to set down some kind of esoteric pro forma that nobody can understand as an abstraction which is irrelevant to what you do and extraneous to your life, and you just got to show up here from 12 to 2, get it over with, and go on to the next thing. My sense is that this is, at least for some of you, or one of you, or two of you, maybe more of you, it's something that belongs to your own life, or could, and it's probably something that you have at least a vague conception of in terms of what history is. I think we'll find out it has something to do with the meaning of time, or what time is. And there are words that are associated with this topic: the present, what that is, or the past, what that is, or the future, what that is, or forward or backward, or whether these conceptual notions have any real meaning. I mean, you've heard me talk on a number of occasions about words and the use of words. We're going to do something with Frank in the next couple of days. And the connections or disconnections between what you say or what's done, I think is very much a part of this discussion. I don't think I can tell you what history is. Like, here it is. There are guys like, Jeff would probably know these guys, but like Toynbee, Marx, we mentioned last time, Oswald Spengler, who are famous, in quotes, historians, who have a format or a way of putting human life together, at least in a certain period, and saying, this is the way it works. And I think saying this is the way it works is another one of these examples of us, or we, or you, or me, imposing on events and things and items and stuff a structure or an organization, maybe because without it, it's impossible to go ahead. So it's conceivable that there is no history at all. Intrinsically, it's extrinsic, and it has to do with what we need to operate in the world and what gives our world meaning. I wanted to make a couple of references to the painting by Courbet, and a reference to the quotation at the bottom, which I've used before, so I don't mean to bore you with it. But I think it's another example of an extremely articulate and in some ways sad intellectual character in the 19th century, trying to explain the need to explain and the inability to explain what he wants to explain. Can't do it. So this is the desperate man who needs history. So I'm going to read you something here, okay? And very slowly. So this is a piece of a poem. It's a very long poem, but I pulled out a few sections. Oh, the raw land without end, and the sky without end, and man fallen, outsprawled on the land, the raw, pitiless, endless land. Only the man had end, and he trembled, for how could he breathe knowing all this endlessness? How could he fashion here his home? How could he walk not an alien here? So fear-furiated, he smote the land with gorgeous hatred, spat yellow venom at the sky, shrieked bloated vengeance, while endless land and endlessness of sky impassive waited. So this is a hypothesis that might argue that history is created as a form or as a structure or as a limit in a context which has no intrinsic limits. So the raw land without end, and here comes 700 BC, 200 BC in Nazca, which is a colossal concoction made maybe over 600-700 years by a number of theories about Nazca. You probably know it, probably seen it. They're very abstract geometries. There are pure geometries. There are animals. There are plants. It goes over an area of the Peruvian desert of about 37 miles, 1 mile by 37 miles. Fascinating, which looks to be a kind of conversation between the people who made it and the sky. Is there a connection between the earth and the sky? So there are all sorts of cultures and all sorts of religions and all sorts of manifestations, again, about trying to put things together, because if you can't put them together, you don't know how to put one foot in front of another. So this is an effort to create lines and perimeters and boundaries and limits and a frame of reference and a series of associations that would give meaning. So the people who made it, and actually what they do is of some interest, the desert is rocky, smooth, roughly speaking, but rocky. And to scrape away the rocks, when they scrape away the rocks, they reveal the sand, smooth sand, a little bit like beach sand underneath. So that's how the lines, are drawn. So what I'm saying is the desert is nothingness. And into the desert come the lines, and the lines put down by the people who put the lines down, who assign a meaning to the lines between them and their culture and the earth and the sky. And that allows them to move. Out of hand sprang tool, out of tool machine by number sired. Out of machine the city, there you go, the city built on guile, the land's face altered from face of no thing human to man's face, limits where no limits are, bounds where there are no boundaries, minutes where hours are not, space manacled, bisected, split, geometrized, man symmetry, man pattern, man measure, man exteriorizing man to dwell in man's exteriority, upflung the city, the berouged city, the devilishly contrived city, the ego city, the megalomaniac city, the city of supreme delusion, the unspeakable city, booming and crashing. This is one of a series of images that I put up here. Belongs to a chronology of urban development. And this one I called the city of instinct, which is a slightly different discussion than this one, but it has to do with a lack of methods or patterns for making a city in terms of streets or building types or collections of buildings. In other words, no organizational strategy a priori, but a piecemeal structure which is assembled and you learn as you do it. So I mean, I would prioritize that way of learning, but this is less the subject than the subject that the city, in this conception, that the city belongs not to let's make it a port, or let's make it on a trade route, or let's make it where a religious event took place. It's something a little bit more elemental than that. It says we make the city to give our life a boundary and a perimeter and a story. And our story takes place in the city, but it's our story. That's why we made it. This is from the first piece on the left. So this is from everyone's pal, Friedrich Nietzsche. And it's actually a well-known piece. It's much longer than this. It has to do with something called the cows of the field. So the cows are hanging out in the field, not your cows, different cows. And the cows are hanging out in the field, and it's chomping away, and have no idea what they just chomped or what they will chomp or what they should chomp. They have no memory. They're not sad. They're not happy. They're not any of those things. It's a condition of not knowing. And what's of interest to me about this is I think I started off by saying that we need a frame of reference, that history is a necessity. It's a psychological necessity. We need to give references and organize meaning. So Nietzsche then comes along and in a slightly different way says, yeah, you ought to know that, whatever that is, or history, whatever that is, but it's anguish and it's difficult and it's painful. And therefore, once you've made those limits, although he doesn't describe it that way, and once you understand the context of that discussion, what's history, what do you have to do in order to go forward? You got to forget it. And there's certainly an irony in this, that we start off by saying it's a necessity, it's a psychotherapeutic necessity. It gives a context for a discussion. Whether it is intrinsically so, I'm saying it isn't, but it gives a context, and if you don't question it, then you have a frame of reference from past to present to future, and so on. So he is saying no, yes, and then say no, and that to do anything, certainly to do anything in the arts, you need to disassociate yourself, disconnect yourself, forget about what you've learned. Meaning, you have to operate outside of history in order to be able to act. You have to forget time. And the other little cartoon has to do with a subject Jeff and I talked about a few weeks ago, which is whether meaning comes from inside or outside or both, or how much of each. That there are all sorts of things available to us that will make the life circumstance intelligible, so they say. And I think the answer to this would be that the origins of what you do and when you do and how you do it and why you do it, if they're to be genuine and legitimate, have to arise internally. So these are really two versions. There's a wonderful book. It's an old book by Andre Malraux called The Voices of Silence. And it's not encyclopedia-like, but it has, I think, some of that effect. And it discusses art from the most primitive cave art, which is not so primitive, to the current day, at least to his current day. And he raised this question in that house of shadows where Rembrandt still plies his brush. All the illustrious shades from the artist of the caverns onward follow each movement of the trembling hand that is drafting for them a new lease of survival or of sleep. And then there's a quote there from ESPN, Father Time is undefeated. Usually, I think, used with reference to quarterbacks who were washed up. And so this is a question of, I said at the beginning that history has everything to do with time, or what time is, although we read a poem that said minutes were hours or not. So some conception of our life in time, which clearly has limits. And what Malraux is talking about is the durability of art, which we talked about in the past. If you make something, does it last beyond you? And the implication is, if you make something and it outlasts you, then in a certain sense, you beat time. And the painting is also, it's one of the most horrible. Have people seen this painting? It's in the Prado. Anybody seen this thing? It's, when you realize, this was on the wall of Goya's house, which wasn't far. So son of a bitch lived in the house with this painting on the wall. I can't walk by the thing. I mean, it's so good in a certain way in terms of the poignancy of it, but it's revolting. And I mean, I guess if you're a 12-year-old and you watch what you watch now, nothing turns your stomach. So I can't speak for everyone, but for me, it's an extremely tough thing to look at. And as I said, it was painted on the wall, and then when he died, they cut it down, took it and put it in the Prado. Saturn, you will recall, there are various interpretations of this and various symbolisms, but Saturn, among other things, represents time. And the prognosis was that Saturn's children, or one of his children, would overthrow him. And in the story, that turned out to be Zeus overthrowing Saturn. So Saturn is going around eating. Shit. Huh? Yeah, that undid everything I ever said. And so Saturn devouring his children in hopes of preventing what history would say. So this is an odd role for history, that there's history, that there's a story, there's a prognosis, and he's trying to shortcut or change the story as a story. And of course, in the end, apparently he failed. But there's a broader interpretation of this, not so different from Malraux, which is time devouring itself. You know, that whatever comes up is eaten, is devoured, goes away, and so on. So this is an image you'll probably see again from me. It has to do with the pain of history. So there's no history, and then we invent history, and then we understand history, and then history is painful. So we end it. Okay, we end it. I think the word is eschatology, the end of time. So there's this famous piece by Isaiah, and another one, the wolf with a lamb, and they beat their swords into plowshares. And this Durer etching, which is fantastic. It's a wood etching made at the very beginning of the 16th century, I think. War, famine, pestilence, and death, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, to the final battle, the Armageddon. Time ends, because time is difficult in history. We need, and now we need a way out. And this is the way out of history. One other thing I would say, I've said this before, that the context, that the audience for this image on the right knew the story. So there's a community that knew the story, knows the biblical frame of reference, understand it. It's a very different problem than we have today, where the stories we tend to talk about, we, at least this group, don't have much traction or legibility outside the group where we're sharing this. Wait a minute. Now this is an alternative, and I think I said in the beginning, I can't tell you what it is. I think I can tell you what it might be, what it might not be, and I think this is also a piece of the story, and it's antithetical, I think, to what I was just talking about. That history has something to do with making connections across time and defining what time is, and conceivably where it starts and how it might end, all of which seem to me to be conveniences that have to do with our own psychological necessities and not to do with any extrinsic method or system that accounts for what history is. So this is also very early, and I like that, because I think there's a great interest in people who think they're up to date and contemporary and informed, and we can see that there are actually very poignant and useful commentary that's very old. I don't know how this is, but 2,500 years old or something like that. And this comes out of Ecclesiastes, so you know the Ecclesiastes, where all the rivers flow into the sea, and the sea is not full, and all of that. It's a kind of, it comes and it goes, and it comes and it goes. And in a context like SCI-Arc, when there are discussions continuously about new and what's new and make it new and all of that, and he's saying it's not like that. That new doesn't come along, but repetition comes along. And further, in terms of the idea of history that we don't remember. You know the line, that Santayana line, those who don't remember history are condemned to repeat it. So this is, and there's another answer on the subway wall that says, even if you do remember it, you repeat it. And this is a different one, which says, nobody remembers. And this is also true, or has some truth to it. That things that happen that seem to be so monumental, and a certain amount of time passes, and then the importance or the focus or the pertinence of the event dissipates and disappears. So this is a famous drawing of Blake that you know, and again, it's not so much what God is as what I, or in this case he, say God is, that it comes from the personal. And there's a proverb in Proverbs, I wrote it down, when he sets a compass on the face of the deep. So this is another effort, I think, a biblical effort, and then picked up 2,000 years later by William Blake, to try to give the world an organizational structure and logic that ratifies our need, our process of thinking, and our need, in this case, literally, the use of geometry, to account for what things are and why they are. Because God's logic is clearly our logic. That's said facetiously. And the writer here is making the point that that means all of us, that you can't separate your conceptual model from the fact that it's your model. There is no empirical model extraneous to you. The model belongs to you. It's your model. And in his view, that model includes, and this gets back to history, if history is everything up to what happened a second ago, includes a look backwards and an assessment of what that look means. So this is Lucien Freud. His work is comforting by being discomforting, I think. And so I put this syllogism together. The lady that's quoted, history is an art like all other sciences. In other words, what it is, the history of history, in this rendition, the history of history is the history of historians, I would say, following this. It's not any particular version which we have found to be empirically so. And then the second piece, this is from Freud, and you can see what it means in the painting, the weight or the obligation that art is biographical. And he's not the only one to say that. I remember Thomas Wolfe, the You Can't Go Home, Thomas Wolfe, saying the only thing he could ever write about was himself. And I can remember people saying to me, doing introductions in the last few years, you're really just talking about what you do. And so this is, whether that's true or not, or partially true, this is Freud's sense of what the real meaning of art, and I think by extension perhaps architecture is. So if science is an art and art is autobiographical, that makes history autobiographical if you accept the logic, which means history is nothing more or less, and it could be more, than a personal rendition. There's another great painting, and you you know, this is all the usual art history class references, you know, the church is on one side, whatever associations you make with that, there's a river or a cliff on the other side. And this is Bruegel, 16th century painting. And so these guys are tripping over each other, and I think there is a story. Each one has a different problem with vision, which I'm not sure that's so, but it's conventionally that each one can't see, but each one can't see for different reasons. But I think the broader conceptual point is that who can lead, or can anyone lead, or does the idea of lead in a discussion, in this case of what's history and meaning and time, really belong to you? There is a guy in Greek mythology called Tiresias, so some of you may recall Tiresias, who was half man, half woman, and he was blind, of course, and therefore he was the only one who could see. So there's an additional component of this, that you have to take your eyes away, see meaning to understand, in order to understand. And then the quote, which is from somebody you probably don't know, has something to do with a more relativistic conception of the discourse on history, that the same things in an empirical sense, so if you wanted to analyze what the dirt was, or the rocks were, or the formation was, it's probably relatively consistent. And yet the way of looking at it, seeing it, and understanding it varies from century to century. And I think this is again wrong, at least in terms of what we're talking about, that it varies not only from century to century, but it varies from person to person. This is the last one, and it's also a quote that I've used before, and I like a lot. And I would say this is not one dump truck; it's two dump trucks. And if you read this came off the jacket. I took it off the jacket of the book years ago when I read Foucault's Pendulum, because I think it said something absolutely essential about where we are and the internet and so on. So the truck may represent the ephemerality of what we do, of culture, of civilization, of what goes up, what comes down. There's a memory of it, there's no memory of it, maybe and I think we have to try to describe what that residue or recollection actually means, and to whom and for whom. And then on the other side, they throw in manuscript pages on the masters of the world who lived beneath the earth, the Comte de Saint-Germain, the secrets of the solar system, the measurements of the great periods, the satanic initiation rites, Knights of the Temple, Assassins, Rosicrucians, Brazilian voodoo. Now what do they do with it? They throw it all into the Jewish computer, which of course is the only way to figure everything out. And I think this is also useful to all of us, because there's a flood of information on the left, like there's a flood of buildings and cultures on the right. And the question for us is to sort out what all of that might mean in the face of an infinite amount of data and information, and how to evaluate it. And it may be that in the end, that's the purpose of history, or an idea of history, which would give a context and a meaning and a value, and would enable you to go into the Kabbalistic computer and sort the pieces out. Thank you very much. What? You want to sit down?
I can't wait to get back to Princeton. So, that was something, Eric. and I mean it. I know a lot of people in I know a lot of disciplines, and I know many characters, and I know a lot of painters, I know a lot of scientists. I don't know many disciplines that have as wide a range of characters in them as architecture does. Architecture goes all the way from just, you can't believe he can tie his shoes, to that. And that was really impressive, and I really appreciate, I mean, it was deeply moving and honest and incredibly amazing. But I was kind of looking around the room, and I saw Tom Wiscombe, and I hate to say this, but there was this incredible look of admiration, like this sort of, how does he do that? I have got to learn to do that. Like, how do you, do you have to be Jewish to do that? Is that? And then I was looking at Hernan, and he was saying, why does he do that?
Hernan must have been on his phone.
It was a pretty amazing. Anyway, before we're going to get started, let me just put a couple of things on the table quickly. Before this, to end this, Eric asked the students that signed up for the course for credit to read a book. I think it was the only time he required during his directorship any student to read a book in the entire 10 years, and so he asked them to read a book by John Lukacs, a historian, called something of Hitler. What's it, Hitler? What's it called? The Hitler of History, which is a historian's critical account of five histories of Hitler. If I got that correct?
It's a large number of different biographies.
Okay, but I mean, yeah. So I went through it to
No,
get ready
it
for
isn't.
today.
That's not what it is. It's
I
not,
know.
no, it's
I
not.
know, but
It's a kind of attempt to, it's like history has a history.
right. So that's what my point is. This is a historian who's looked at histories of Hitler written by other historians, and to give a critical assessment of them. So at this point in time, I mean, the point of which I think was an incredibly interesting exercise for him to assign. But it basically means we're in something like a metacritical, we're in a position where we're stepping back from being in history as a metaphysical environment to being aware that we're in history as a operating paradigm of how we view the world. And we understand what Nietzsche says, that we can be in history, but we can step back from it, but we're also not out of it yet. So we're in a very interesting relationship to history. We still don't know how to escape our sense of history determining our sense of self, our sense of the world, our sense of the truth, but we also know there's no such thing as a history or the history, or more particularly the embodiment or force of history, the angel of history, as Benjamin would say. That history is a force or a power that has its own movement, a teleology or an eschatology, as he says it, that history causes changes in its own right. This used to be called the zeitgeist. The original meaning of the zeitgeist was a spirit of the times in the sense of a real spirit, a real force of time that would cause its own changes in its own right. This was what Hegel thought. This is what Marx thought. And so we're not there, but we're also not out of it. And I want to remind you that not everyone else is in this, and that this has had a parochial and local effect on a small part of the world, which we call Western civilization. No one else divides the world into East and West. It has effect on our art and our history and our mathematics. It does produce a kind of science. It does produce a great deal of apparatus. No other civilization the other great civilizations that do not use a teleological or eschatological model of the passage of time, that use recurrent models, civilizations like the Hindus or the Vedic civilizations that use reincarnation or cyclical models, for example, don't produce great sciences or don't produce great mathematics, but they do produce great art, great architecture, great philosophies. And so we share. I mean, architecture, for example, is shared in all of those systems, although in very different ways. Art is shared in all of those systems in very different ways. And so it's a very interesting thing. You know, they don't have great sciences, they don't have great math, they don't have great realism in their art. They don't confuse their architecture with a science of art. Is architecture a science? Is it a service? It is a spiritual practice. And so these issues, I think, become very interesting when you understand that history is a local intellectual construct that we are trapped in. And just to give you a little bit of, before that, there was theology, or what we call it religion. There was a time when God or religion determined the truth, that if you were going to go to hell because you broke the Ten Commandments, you were really going to go to hell. And that the fear of the eternal damnation of your soul was not a belief or a faith. It was a fact, like putting a match to your finger would burn is a fact. And so when you hear of someone torturing kids or throwing kids out or killing people that have just come from an Ebola clinic because they're afraid of them, and you hear that they did that out of superstition, they didn't do that out of superstition. They did that out of a fact. We call it a superstition. We call it their belief system. It's their fact. So you have to remember that what we think of as our facts are our facts that come from our metaphysical environment, which determined first by the fact that we live in a historical world, but others don't, you know, and others, what we call their superstitions or their mythologies or their faiths, practice entirely different practices. And so, but one of the things that moves through all of these things fairly smoothly are art practices, like architecture. And so I think it becomes an interesting thing to talk about. So I just wanted to set that as a place to begin with, and then we're going to have a conversation. This is the last conversation. It has been incredibly fun. I hope it hasn't been too private. I hope you'll get involved, particularly if you've read the Lukacs story. The Lukacs book. So you were giving an account of, let's say, the larger context of history. And I think, you know, the idea of the untimely meditations is what that particular quote from, but the larger idea that we need to forget history comes from The Use and Abuse of History, which is a really wonderful and easy to read essay by Nietzsche. And when he lays out history as a set of techniques, when you can use it and when it's to your advantage, and when it gets abused, when it turns into an instrument of politics, for example, or when it turns into ways you can abuse it. So it's called The Use and Abuse of History. I recommend it to you. And one of the ways this idea that you need to forget it often, you need to forget history when it's an abuse when it's used against you. For example, in the question of precedent, you know, precedent is an important idea in law, in the sense that you don't want to change a law frivolously. But the question is precedent an important idea in architecture? What are the persistencies in architecture that, you know, for example, should we pay attention to the patterns that are contained in an existing type in the sense of a precedent, and honor those patterns for what reason? Yeah, you're at the right volume, relative to mine.
It depends on how you want to narrow the discussion. I mean, in the tiniest sense, associations, like Tom's doing this thing, the 100, whatever it is. Are you doing that? That list of 100?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I was talking to him about it. And we were just talking about that.
Tell him what it is, you know.
Tom's been trying for a while to go around to a group of characters.
Yeah.
Why go to those characters is another question, and it's part of this discussion in a way, but presuming certain people to have a special expertise, and then to list buildings of the 20th century 100 that influenced you, that are meaningful to you, that are useful to you. There's no real explanation of why they're useful or how they're useful or even the meaning of the term useful. And all that applies to what you just asked. I mean, I don't think there's any intrinsic reason why anything that was done yesterday ought to be a model for something which is done tomorrow. Why should it be? So you're asking.
Are you asking that? Are you asking?
Well,
that?
you're asking me whether precedents are useful. I mean, when you wander around and you look at what's done and you assemble a certain amount of information. One thing was of some interest when Suha was here the other day, which is not a particularly distinguished lecture in terms of verbiage, but showed a lot of material that most people don't see from around the world. And what you start to understand, and it's always fascinating, is what you think you know and what you actually know, which is not a hell of a lot. So I don't know that the precedents that are conventionally recited in institutions like the one you just mentioned may not be the precedent for anything. In other words, the precedent for Culver City might be Stonehenge or Lascaux. So what precedent, for what reason, to what purpose? And I think what I'm saying is that decision ultimately ought to belong, like a lot of decisions that give your life meaning or an attempt to give it meaning, belong to you, that's all. And you have to decide. So you could ask someone who said, okay, I used a certain geometric frame of reference to make the Sydney Opera House. Okay, I took an orange and my associations with geometry go back to Proverbs, when God put a compass on the face of the deep. So I know if God put a compass on the face of the deep, I can put a compass on the Sydney Harbor. That's my precedent. God did it, I can do it. Okay?
But I mean, if you know that earlier work contains already in it a lot of knowledge about the patterns of life, about in other words, it already contains a lot of work in it. And you use that because it's a shortcut to understanding that knowledge, and you can build on that knowledge.
Well, I don't know if there are any shortcuts. I mean, that's the question. It's funny, because I'm doing a studio now, and it has to do with prototypes. Rooftop is a prototype, quadrangle as a prototype,
okay.
And the supposition in those is that in fact there are lessons to be learned, but the caveat is, are there lessons to be learned? Not ipso facto there are lessons to be learned, so that's to be determined.
But I mean, that's another model of history rather than just a large metaphysical environment like you laid out. I mean, that's a model of we can learn from the past by I learned the game quickly so I can move forward as an expert more expediently. Well,
that's what happens. That's what happens. So if you sit here and talk to Wolf and you say to Wolf, hey.
We're going to get to that.
Well, I mean, Wolf, whoever it is this week.
Well, this week is very important on this question.
Well, you say to somebody, hey, guess what? When you work today, how different is that from working 35 years ago? Because what you're saying is, in the interim, you learned something. And what you learned is what? How to get from here to there in a straighter line? And if that's what you learned, maybe the way you did it at the beginning was better than the way you're doing it now.
Well, okay, then you're asking me that, I was going to close on this question. I'll go ahead and move to it now. Does it matter to you? Actually, I think you said it in your talk. So.
That's over, man.
I know, that was so yesterday.
Don't quote me. That's so 20 minutes ago.
I know, but you seem to like to quote people. I'm quite interested.
Well, they're a point of reference, especially some people, to me.
Okay,
they're useful to me. They might not be useful to you.
Can I just tell you my attitude about quotes? This has got nothing to do with him. But when somebody comes to me and says a quote, like Nietzsche said, what I would like you to think to yourself is, so what?
Right.
You know?
That's
What I'd like
exactly
to
right.
know is, do I give a damn what he, like, I don't care who said it. I like to care, do I agree?
Well,
What do I
let
think
me
about-
take you back to your friend Andre Malraux.
Okay.
Who did at
Oh, yes,
least
he was
one or
my-
two things. And I think his only point, you know, the argument that it's the best Greek playwrights aren't Aeschylus or Sophocles or Euripides or Aristophanes. The best one is at the bottom of the Aegean, and you never met him.
Yeah.
Okay? Because we don't know. So Malraux are, and that may be true, but we don't know, except our supposition is always what we know is what is.
You'll-
Then somebody comes along and said, wait a minute, dinosaurs had feathers after years of, you know, so I think the point is that those references change. And Malraux seemed to be saying that what endures has whatever staying power is. I mean, if you think Ecclesiastes hangs around, so it's not so much it hangs around and Hemingway writes a book and he calls it The Sun Also Rises. And the subject of the book is in a different way the subject of Ecclesiastes. But he gave it a different context and a different meaning. So I think you're completely right. When you quote something, that's not like saying so-and-so said it and therefore genuflect. It's not like that. But I think it is acknowledging
Yes.
Malraux's point, which is that if there is some durability, which doesn't leave out the possibility that better things have gotten lost. Because sure as hell, in terms of the other point in Ecclesiastes, that nobody remembers anything, that there's probably plenty of good stuff that got forgotten.
Right.
Nevertheless, I would say the reason for some of those quotations, which, you know, Kierkegaard had a comment, don't ever quote me, which is don't ever quote me because it's all like this, and when you do this, you've disconnected all the pieces.
Right.
You can never disconnect the pieces. If you disconnect the pieces, you've lost the meaning. Don't quote me, you lost the meaning. Okay?
Yeah.
So we're acting in defiance of his admonition. So I'm willing to do that. And all I'm saying is, when I put that stuff up or an image up, this is a context which lends itself to that, for better or worse. When I do that, that is not to say, go read this, go see. I would say of any of those things, go see the thing in the Prado, which is
Sure.
astonishing.
I mean, you do it
But
to
that doesn't
honor
mean
the writer.
I think to honor an effort,
Sure.
or efforts by a few people over a long period of time that have touched on these subjects in very different ways. And they're useful. If you're dealing with those subjects, they're useful and they're productive, not by allegiance, not by I'm going to sign up for the party of Goya or Romney, but because I know that if I'm trying to
Yes.
learn, it's worth trying to learn. And what I would say about this whether an architect 35 years ago is the same architect today, and if that architect is different, and if that architect has learned to expedite over that period of time, then there's also an argument that you ought to unlearn it, whether that's intellectual and physiologically possible. In other words, that you have to start over all the time. The argument was always that Saarinen was one of the rare guys that did that. Maybe Utzon too, that started over and started over and started over, and sometimes it stumbled and sometimes it didn't. But the confidence in what they did and the lack of an enduring confidence in what they did, I think would be my answer to the precedent
But
question.
when I know quite a few architects, and this question is a question out of admiration for all of these. And although I have to tell you, I prefer the people who are going to answer you, who I think will answer this yes, or I hope you will. The question is this: do you, not as an intention or an ambition when you design a work, but are you aware of and look forward to the possibility that your work will find a place, in some sense, in the history of architecture?
I think the answer is yes, but I don't know that that's the motive for doing it. Because I think
understand that.
The more primary motive would be, I mean, I was talking about trying to get from here to there, and my way, which obviously can be criticized from a human point of view for lots of reasons, because not only what it includes, but because of what it disregards and what problems that makes. But for me, it was a way to try to deal with a raw land without end. That's
But
how
also,
I used it. And
you
whether
mentioned-
architecture gets to be used that way by everybody.
But you mentioned also in your talk that in some sense, if it does, then there's been some verification of its staying power. You know?
Yeah.
It's been my,
And now Roe is saying people are fighting for that.
right, that you fight for your staying power, not in some sense because of its promise of immortality, but just it's sort of a verification
Of content.
of content, right? In fact, I wanted to say that to the students. You oftentimes say meaning, and they always, and I think it confuses students and also critics that just as a trick, next time you hear Eric on a review or giving a lecture and he uses the word meaning, substitute consequence. Just, there's all kinds of, he means meaning, but it can mean all sorts of things. It can mean affective meaning. It could be performative meaning. So if you just substitute architectural consequence, it will serve equally to what he means.
You know what's great about that?
It doesn't have to mean paraphrase.
What you just said, it's a really good point, and I appreciate it and I support it. It does ultimately point to the difficulty of talking about anything or writing about anything, because the fact of the matter is almost any talking and any writing relies on a series of associated meanings or suppositions, all of which are completely suspect. Or most, like somebody can stand up and talk about the past and the present and the future. And they say, what's that? You know, the little kid, why? And so that I think the point is a good point. It probably applies to lots of discussions with lots of people. And I think the one thing that I've tried to do here and in the office too is to be aware of the fact that what you're saying is based on something, and what is it actually based on, and is that an enduring basis for making a decision? And if it isn't, is that the premise for making decisions, like precedents? You know?
So, given the fact, one way I think I know that I've come to learn as I go from, where are you guys going? Come back here. Nah, get out of here, sit. We don't care about you anyway.
It's getting
Vicky
boring.
Vale. Do you know Vicky Vale?
It's getting boring.
So the way a kind of rule of thumb I have about architects that care whether their work gets inscribed in history or not is whether they value and keep an archive of their unbuilt work. It doesn't always work, but it seems to work, although it doesn't quite work in this formula. You do. Peter Eisman does. Some people do because they think it might be worth a value to their estate, you know, so they kind of store everything and stuff like that. But, for example, Frank Gehry keeps it all. But Frank Gehry, when he does a project and it doesn't get built or it gets ended, he will not think or talk about it anymore. As far as he's concerned, once a project is out of the movement towards building, it's out of his mind completely. He loses interest in it totally. It has no life for him at all. Although I think Frank...
Who told you that?
Frank. I've worked with him for a long time. I wanted to write a book about 10 unbuilt projects. I trust him. It's not that he doesn't think other people might be find it interested in life, but he doesn't. I mean, for maybe 6 months, I'm sure he was unhappy about losing the China project for a number of months. But for some reason, he just detaches himself from it. For example, I know 3 or 4 unbuilt projects of Frank Gehry that are better than any built project he's ever done, as I'm sure you do. I can't get him interested in publishing them. He didn't even want to do the Peter Lewis House film. I mean, any of that sort of stuff. But I think he knows, he feels confident that his work is going to find a place in history based on his buildings. So he's a person who just thinks architecture is the building. But I think he also thinks his work will go down in history because of the buildings. And these are 2 people you're going to be talking to this week, and I want to raise that. Wolf Pricks, I've come to believe earnestly when he tells me and you, and I hope someone from this audience will ask him, has absolutely no interest in his place in history as an architect, in a sense that because of his past, because of his cultural relationship to architecture, and because of his political relationship to architecture, he believes the building shapes the lives of people. And he believes that a good architect or good architecture thought that way has a profound effect on transforming the lives of people in a political way, in an existential way. I think he understood that that was the consequence of his growing up in Vienna when he did and how he did. And that's all he cares about. And he will make, I think if we ask him this question, or you ask him this question on Thursday, he'll make snide and cynical remarks about, yes, that's, I don't care about history, what I care about is money and all that sort of stuff. But the fact is, I really do believe he thinks that an intellectualization of the work, the processes of historical consideration, the objectification of the work in this environment really are misguiding, or have a tendency to act as misguiding forces in the field, and that one must continue to focus on the fact that buildings themselves have a transformative power, and until you keep that in the forefront, you're missing the point of the work. And when he was here with Tom, he asks it with a lighthearted sense and a love of young architects, I think. But you can also see the desperation that he's worried that no young architect cares about that anymore, or even knows it anymore. And
I'll tell you something, if you listen to the Raymond Abraham, I mean, I don't think you got the story right.
Well, I'm going to ask him. But these are the 2 people that are coming.
But if you listen to his lecture, which was an unusual lecture, the last year or whenever it was, he gave, and because Raymond is Viennese, a detailed retrospective on the roles of various characters, including Hollein, including Raymond, in a litany of characters and associated meanings, what's inherited, and so on and so on. So he actually constructed, and including work that wasn't built and so on. So I would say there's in many ways more to Wolf than Keith Richard.
I think he's no question about it. Come on, that's don't be, of course. I mean, Wolf is one of the really, he knows, I think he's really torn on this issue, but I think deep in his soul, he wants to believe that the legacy of his work will be the performance, the psychological, political performance of his buildings on a population.
What's interesting about that, and I realize now I forgot it, I had a piece up on Angkor Wat, which is, as far as we know, a religious center with temples. In other words, a preserve which excludes a big piece of what is conventionally understood as cities and the interrelationship of people in cities. It's a religious zone. It's a huge one. And it's not understood over time because it's broken and it's lost and the people are gone and all of that. So there's another aspect of the relationship of time and architecture, or time and art, which has to do with how much time we talking about. And it's not just 20 minutes ago. And so that there are things which interested me very much, which emerge or reemerge with associations that are suppositions. You actually don't know. I remember this business with Stonehenge, and somebody stuffed it into a computer and said, well, it's pretty good for amateurs. And then somebody else came along and said, no, it has nothing to do with that. That's you imposing you on, so on and so on. So I do think that in a contemporary sense, I mean, I don't know what, if you looked at BMW in 300 years, whether the associated meanings would still be there, or in 3,000 years, would they be there? And the time question is just a question of interest. And I have a feeling it's being asked in a more contemporaneous sense. But I think when you look at work, and I think Malraux's reference, I mean, Malraux started with Let's Go. That's where I picked it up.
Well, if you look at David Watkins' Rise of Architectural History, which I don't recommend, it's a really boring book by a real asshole. You will discover, interestingly enough, however, that teaching architecture as a history, rather than a technical craft that you could learn by you could go visit some well-known buildings, but teaching it as a history of masters and canonic buildings. The first architects that you know that were educated in that system, even though they were primarily educated in ateliers, were Wright, Korb, and Mies. So the birth of modern architecture is the birth of an architect educated in a historical context. I mean, I think it's a very interesting, and that's when issues like the way one traveled to learn architecture was not just to travel to learn construction techniques or cultural differences, but also to visit most important monuments and important, so in a sense, architecture, we go back and we rewrite our history back to let's say, the pyramids, but it begins then, and it's a fairly new discipline, and we don't call ourselves master builders, we call ourselves architects, and so we rewrite our histories over and over and over again to make them older and older and older again, as you know. I keep trying to go back, what I want to keep going back is, again, asking ourselves in what ways do we have history and admit them, and what are the possible ways that we're acting historically and not? For example, I don't think it's true any longer that the legitimate sites, historical sites of architecture and historical performances of architecture are real buildings on real sites. And I think it's been a long time since that's been the case. I think we've known for a long time in our own field that unbuilt projects have exercised as important a force in the discipline as built projects. Certainly we know that. I mean, I don't know, I could go, if I wanted to be obscure, I could name all sorts of unbuilt projects, but let's just say the Bibliothèque Nationale of Koolhaas or all sorts of stuff. Europe, some unbuilt projects. Everybody's got unbuilt projects that we know in the canon. The canon that we teach in that that list that Tom will put together.
All built.
He's requiring it to be all built.
There's another list coming.
But it's totally idiotic to say all built. I mean, because that's just, well, it's just like Tom. I don't mean to say Tom is totally idiotic, but it's not that far off. Tom is a great architect, but he himself, his own work, some of his best work is unbuilt work. Nara. What is he gonna do about Nara?
Put it in the second list.
The second list of influential unbuilt work.
I think. You have to ask him, but I think so.
I don't know. Anyway, but do we start to admit that publication is as important as building? You do. You sure like to publish a lot.
I don't.
In fact, you seem to like to publish a whole lot.
Yeah, I don't think you can confuse. I mean, if you have, if you have 4 or 5 characters working for 15 years building the pterodactyl, you can't replace that with 12 pages in a magazine.
That's
You're
right.
extrapolating experience. There is a complete non sequitur.
Well, I'm
And
not
everybody
saying one
that-
is, I'm saying, are they both legitimate?
So the meaning to the people who did it, who shared it, and which will probably never, at least in a literal sense, be understood by anybody who looks at it in a book or in a magazine. That's the meaning, and that's the meaning in a day-to-day sense. If you look at what's going on with this high-rise building, and it's steel, and the core is this, and the isolators are that, and the ribbons are this, and the glass got, and the process of actually going through that, never mind meeting with 25 people in the building department and the experts and the peer review who have 26 opinions on whether the thing's going to fall down or not. And there's something about it defines your life. I mean, it's for better or worse, there's a tension in it. You don't know how it's going to come out.
I got it.
And
I
that's
do.
completely different than publishing, which is, if you're publishing buildings, a retrospective. Okay, now we know it didn't fall down. Or I guess maybe now we know it didn't fall down. Now we know it didn't fall down, and we're going to show off.
At the moment.
And we're going to tell you how we did all of these things, and we're going to tell you as if we knew from the beginning where it would end. But I can tell you, if you came to me 3 years ago and asked me whether the pterodactyl would get built, I would say likely, and I think my proclivity to lean in that direction. But those columns were standing up there rusting for 10 years, and he didn't build it. So, I think that's what it's about.
Okay, let me ask you a slightly different way. You know the story of Giulio Romano and Raphael walking through. You know,
I hope not. No, I don't know that story.
any historians in the audience?
I don't know that. So tell me the story. Maybe
Dora,
I know.
do you know this story?
Who?
Giulio Romano and Raphael walking through and falling into the tomb of Nero's treasury. Anybody know this story?
So what's the story?
They find out that
Raphael broke his arm.
they find out that classical architecture was actually painted colors. And yeah, so you know this story? I mean,
Come on, tell us the
here's the
story.
problem: is I'm going to tell it, I'm going to make it a good story, but I'm going to get some of the facts wrong, and then some stupid historian
tell
is
us
going to correct me. So
tell
I
us the
just
story.
okay. The point is this: all of the Renaissance.
The point is the history they learned was wrong.
No, the Renaissance and the Baroque thought all of classical architecture was white because all of the paint and the color had fallen off. Giulio Romano and Raphael fall into this tomb in which it had been protected, and they discover that all of it, including more likely than not the Parthenon and everything else, had been painted.
Yep.
And so
We
what,
did that in that Ohio State discussion because Gannon sent it to me, and I was
So
going, it's talked about.
what I'm saying is there's a perfect case of the building not being what you said. I mean, that in fact, the publication, which was
Well, no, but that's the
fallen off-
building over time.
I know, but they didn't know it was over time. They
Well, that's the
thought,
story that the best Aeschylus is in the bottom of the Aegean. You actually don't know
you
what
don't
you're
know.
talking
But so what
about.
they thought that what they were doing was honoring the right and real thing, and all they were honoring was a bad publication.
Well, they just didn't have the information. There's always
No,
more
they did
or
have the
less.
information. They just
Well,
had,
if you go to the British Museum has
I'm
an,
trying to help Hernan's work here.
listen, if you go to the British Museum had or recently had an exhibition with the Elgin marbles that
Yes, of
someday will go back with the colors.
Yes, with
This
the
is how
colors.
we think
Yeah,
the
yeah.
bar. Similar if you go to the Yucatan, you go to Chichen Itza, And
This
you
is what
go
it
to the
would-
ball
yeah.
court, and you go to the ball court in Chichen Itza, and it's all very austere stone. Then you look up in like the far most obscure corner where you get the least weather and so on and so
And you
on.
realize
And
that,
after
yeah.
500 years, you see little red and green
Yeah,
and
it's
so
like
on
the
and
people
so on.
complaining at the Sistine
Nero's
Chapel.
house, Nero, the toughest son of a bitch in the world, Trajan dumped his forum on top of Nero, couldn't crush the thing. And it's also true in Nero's house. He's a tough guy, and all of this vaulted stuff, and it was painted with some filigree stuff. It was.
He was mean. There are mean
I don't know about that.
feats.
He's a pyromaniac.
You know, all I'm saying, yeah, so what I'm saying is, I don't think that, I mean, what you're saying is by the time you put the hysterical labor of love into it, there's no way you're going to let yourself say that there's an equal.
They're different. They have different purposes
Yeah.
and different meanings.
They have, but
in
what
a
I would say
day-to-day
is
sense, you're not going to live off. It's a
there are
misfit.
many, and have always been many authentic contexts for architecture that are historical contexts. You know, I mean, the role of history. So history is no longer. It no longer has a single authorizing force. It no longer has a single ability to identify a context. There is no person who can. So the problem of Lukacs' book is Lukacs is going to arbitrate this discussion as if there will be a final arbitrage. You know, and our problem today is we maintain a market for final arbitration because we do live in historical and rational consciousness.
You know what's funny? And I was looking at this yesterday, trying to make a couple images to talk to Frank. And Frank dumped some money on SCI-Arc.
Boy, I tell you, I don't envy you.
Huh?
I
Wait a
don't
minute.
envy you with him.
And there's a prize given in his
Yeah.
name.
No, I know.
And there's a quote that I picked out that accompanies the prize. So when I give it to somebody, so I have to read the quote. I mean, I have to, but I thought it was an appropriate quote. And it's from your favorite historian, Thucydides.
Yes.
And it's about so, you know, this is frank, contemporary discussion.
know
The
the quote,
quote
yeah.
is from 5th century or 4th century Athens, and it says something like these people were born never to be at peace with themselves and to prevent the rest of the world from doing so. And that was my caricature of what Frank did.
My
From
favorite
from
quote from
2,500
Frank
years ago.
is 90% of the stuff that's built in the world is bullshit. And then all I want to add
No,
to
the
that
answer
is
to that was the percentage was too low.
no, but what I think he should then say is thank God for them. You know,
Yeah, I know what's coming.
that leaves a place for what I'm doing. That's how else can I? Like, what if it wasn't? Anyway, other questions about history? Any thoughts? Any guys from you? Who read the book? You didn't read the book. You get. Let me get a student. Who? Ben, pick somebody that was in your class. Just point to them. You read it? Did you buy the book? Okay. How'd that feel buying a book? Have you ever bought one before?
All right.
Have you ever been forced against your will to buy a book before?
No.
You'd heard of Hitler?
Yeah.
These are
I
like,
mean,
notice how
it-
I'm
I mean, the
moving in
book-
the right direction.
The book itself was interesting, where it kind of for to me as a personal view on the book is that how he deconstruct the idea of the Adolf Hitler as a devil side, and like not as a figure of devil, like it's more of a how and what happened around him, and then seeing it critically outside of the historian point of view kind of thing. So that was really intriguing.
Did you ever start to not trust him?
Personally, I don't really trust the historian's point of view in terms of when it comes to history. Like, it just,
Yeah, but that means,
me-
did you not trust Lukacs? In other words, you say, personally, I don't trust historians, and as you're reading this book, he's a
he
historian.
made some good arguments, but I don't, at the end, I don't think so.
So my question is, does that leave you thinking I wasted my time?
No, certainly not. It's just I know, like, it's more important for me to know what others think about what other stuff is, instead of me saying that this is the truth, this is what I should believe in, and this is what it's going for kind of thing. So, yeah.
Now, there's a book by Philip K. Dick called Man in the High Castle. It's a book about as if Hitler had won the war.
Mm.
Should now read that book.
All right, I'll check it out.
I mean, there are other ways to read this story, you know.
Of course.
Anyone else? So
Actually, I have a question for you in terms of the discussion, not more of a
Okay.
book. You mentioned about there are sometimes the unbuilt projects are more powerful than the built project. And I kind of want to see your point of view. If we, as an architect, value so much of those archived, so much of a history of unbuilt project, then what do you, where is the definite line between arts as a discourse and architecture as a discourse? Because to me, something is not built is there's a lack of sense of real scale into it. And then I think that is what it makes difference between the art and architecture. But if we value the unbuilt project as more than the built project, then where do we stand in terms of the architecture? And then where do we stand as an architect?
What do you think about the Tower of Babel? You know it? It's a... You think, well, first of all, you probably think it was unfinished. Yes. You don't really think, you really do think it was unfinished?
Are you saying it wasn't built, or it was?
I abstain.
I think it was built.
You do? I mean, I think unbuilt projects...
They're still building it.
I think, for example, an unbuilt project is a way one architect can communicate to another architect an architectural idea, much like a score is the way a composer can communicate to another composer a musical idea. The building is a performance. It's an important, but it's not the apotheosis of the accomplishment.
But you know, this is important, and there are issues that belong to the construction of a building that never belong and can't belong to a hypothesis.
Yes.
Or a drawn or modeled
Yes,
idea. So you also have to talk about who you're talking to.
Yes.
Or why you're having the discussion. I think it's probably pretty clear that something which has a physiology or a geology or a physical presence has greater likelihood of having a much more substantial constituency. It talks to a much bigger audience, and conceivably an audience which is not a learned audience, and we could question whether the learned audience is actually learned or whether it just repeats themes that it's been taught to repeat. So a broader discussion belongs to building, I think, in most cases. Now, the Tower of Babel, whether it's built or not, would be an exception, but I don't think that would be the equivalent of a Lebbeus Woods drawing. Wouldn't be.
No, it was a cheap answer. But then I have like 6 out of 7 of the what do they call them? Ancient wonders of the Western world. I guess that's a cheap answer too. I mean, your life is, but let's go with an easy one. Bibliothèque Nationale by OMA. Very influential building. Actually, it would have been a horrible library if it had been built. Or here's a better one. Andrew Zago's proposal for the graduation pavilion that Marcelo actually built was actually been horrible. He thanked his lucky stars the day Eric relieved him of the responsibility of having to think about it. But as a proposal, as a concept, as a way of thinking about using available materials, as a way of producing something that connected the history of the school, it's old practices about delimiting the space, about connecting to the pterodactyl. I mean, it was a really fantastically interesting project that I can teach you that project, and you will learn a lot of architecture. You'll learn a lot of architecture as a communication from him to a certain group of faculty to a limited number of architects in this context, a really profound sketch, let's say. And so I do think what Eric just said is really important. Each of these things matters a great deal. Also, lots of built projects, by the time they get built, end up being compromised by the building to the point where...
Well, that's the other side of the equation, that can you hold on to, do you know what matters and where you can concede? I know I've had a lot of these discussions, and some of our friends talking to me and said, for you, it's, you know, my way or the highway or something. You're not going to change anything. This is just not true. I mean, I don't know if it's a compliment or the opposite, but it's not true. The process of actually realizing technically difficult issues has to do with a kind of dexterity which is not the same as a conceptual imagining of the project. And we've talked about this. It's a different skill set. It has to do with dealing with people. It has to do with an understanding of techniques and what might happen that doesn't necessarily always happen, and what it takes to get it to happen. And I think it takes an association between the idea of the building as drawn and the reality of the building as built. And as I said, what of the first has to be sustained in the second, or you're dead. In other words, if this is made out of tin and I make it out of adobe, is that the end of the building? I mean, Disney Hall was stone. It's made out of stone, simple as that. Now it's made out of metal.
Yeah, Disney Hall, when it was originally won the competition, it was made out of stone. In fact, what happened was they said it couldn't be built.
But the story is less the issue than somebody made it like, I quit. You want to build it out of metal? Go get somebody else.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, and you know this, it goes on every day. Liz and Rick's Broad Museum, that was supposed to be a load-bearing wall, and now it's a curtain wall. I mean,
Well, I put columns in the thing.
I know, you know, and so...
Yeah, I mean,
So
I've told this to John and Hernan. We have the same contractor who walked in, the same contractor who walked into the high-rise, what's now been called the wrapper, which has no columns and no beams.
Right.
And said, it's great. We can make it look like that. We're going to give you columns. He went to the owner with that and said, we got to put columns in this thing. Otherwise, you know. And we said, we quit. And the owner, for the moment, stuck with it. So, yeah, I mean, that happens in this process. And I think the art of it, and I think it is an art form of some kind, has to do with negotiating a process with banks, with tenants, with clients, with technique, somehow all interrelated with conceptual content, and trying to sort those things out.
Any more questions? Yeah, okay. No, wait. Shit. Anybody else? Call in from Skype. This better be short.
Super short.
Then I'll go back to you, and then I'm going to wrap it up. Go ahead.
Okay. My question is about like the rewriting of history. If we're telling the story again and again, is then history that we look back on, is the time relevant? Like in last year's Biennale, a lot of the people who were showcasing the elements of architecture were showing the dates of when everything was happening and the progression of it. Is that relevant now, or can we start looking at history as a catalog and not really take that into consideration anymore?
You got to decide for yourself if you need those things to be facts. All of those trappings are trappings to reassure you that they have a factuality, and those factualities reaffirm their significance for being on the wall. They've been chosen from, it's not everything from that date, so they've been put there to produce a persuasive effect, and then they've been given those labels to have that persuasive effect, to have the magic trick. It's what a magician would call a misdirection. Okay, so as long as you understand it's a magic trick with the misdirection, and the fact that's on that wall is part of the misdirection, then you get to choose. As long as you are not a victim of, but you've just paid money to get into the Biennale, or you got in for free, but you knew you were supposed to pay money, then you understand you went to a piece of theater and that you are enjoying the performance of a magic trick. Either one's okay with me, but if you think you've just seen a piece of scholarship that's a fact set in some reasonable historical context that you can make a relatively objective judgment, then that's your problem. Then you're just another architect.
How do you choose to be relevant history? I mean, my favorite history is the one that is announced. Maybe ESPN says, this Sunday history will be made.
Yes.
How do they know? You know, like some sport event or something like that, right? Which is history will be made until next weekend, until history will be made again.
I know, I love those.
But I think there is something about the disciplines they choose to make history relevant. Like, for example, in medicine, history matters to a point, but history is never get confused with criticism or the construction of discourse. It's irrelevant.
Yeah.
You just need to know the facts, okay, the penicillin, but whatever. But medicine is all based on presentness and fact, how many lives you save with this procedure or not. So there is something about architecture in terms of the value that we place in history that is an artificial construction on ourselves.
Absolutely.
To give a moral apparatus to what we do.
No, what you're saying,
But you're making an assumption. You're using a word as if you know what it means.
I
mean,
know what it means. I know you like to...
No,
we have to assume a certain thing we know what it means, Eric, because if not,
Well,
everything has a second meaning.
hang on,
We're
guys,
sure.
hang on.
We
You
don't,
both-
we don't,
you
listen,
both
we don't
actually
have
are
to,
right.
we don't have to assume anything.
You guys are
You have
never
to
gonna sort
assume
this
whatever
out.
you need to assume. The fact is, what is ESPN said in a literal sense is so, automatically so, if you assume history is a record of absolutely everything, like the Brazilian computer. So since it's part of absolutely everything, it is part of the picture, unless you can see outside of the picture, which allows you, hang on,
So you're
which
not
allows you
disagreeing.
then
You are
to,
agreeing with me. You're
Well,
not
it-
disagreeing with me.
if you can see outside the picture. So ESPN is technically correct.
Well, you're agreeing with me.
I
That's
don't-
why you're
what-
pretending to disagree.
No, what I'm saying is how you see outside the picture.
that's how a Jew agrees with a Catholic.
But that's my,
Let's
that's my
let's
exact
not make
point.
it even more parochial. We're not in Ohio. Okay? We're on the coast
No,
now.
Eric, that is exactly my
Right?
point.
Okay,
Setting-
guys, I think I can satisfy both of you.
Don't bother.
In the sciences, let me call to your attention, in the sciences, what's called the history of science is everything that's not a science anymore. So when you study the history of physics, you're studying everything that used to be physics that isn't physics anymore. When you study physics, you study everything that's still physics. So you study the physics, you're not saying in 1986 we learned this, you just say, here's the sciences, here's what we learned today, here's what you go research. And then when you go study the history of physics, you say, we used to think this, we quit thinking this because we learned something new.
But the frame, again, it's
exactly
the
the
same
opposite in
point
the
that
arts.
Hernan made. The frame of reference
Yes.
is the history of the atomic bomb, the history of the scientists who invented it?
Yeah.
Is it?
No, that's
No,
the
it
history.
isn't. It's not. That's not the history. That's a tiny piece of a discussion
I know,
about
but
the structure of
like when you go
matter.
learn to make
which
the
is
an
no.
atomic
It's a
bomb-
decision. Roosevelt and Truman, and it's a political
You
content.
don't learn that when you learn to make an atomic bomb. You learn how to
No,
make a
because you
Zyklon
wouldn't have
2.
learned to make an atomic bomb if they'd have said, go use that energy to
understand.
make a hospital.
I know, but
or a submarine.
But what he said was, in architecture, when you learn architecture, you learn the history as part of doing the work.
That's just a convention.
It's not well, it is a convention.
It's a
but the one
convention.
we're-
What we talked about was whether the
I know, but it's the
convention
one
of
we are now operating under.
precedent is intelligent
I
or
know,
not.
but
You asked the
thank-
question.
I know,
I
but
don't think
thank
the
God
answer
we're-
was yes.
But I mean, thank God we're still in that convention, because if we're not, then we're going to go back to teaching architecture like a technology.
Well, that's not the other option.
What's the other option?
I don't want to go through this again.
You want, okay, so let me close this quickly. One last question. Anybody, I cut you off. You want to ask it, go ahead.
In your presentation, you showed a quote from Ecclesiastes, and it was not the King James Version. It was Ecclesiastes 3:15, which says, the past is the present is the present, and the future is the present.
Doesn't say that.
Hang on. In King James. In King
Yeah,
James.
if you read Ecclesiastes 3:15
In the King James.
in the
Version.
King
Well, this is
James
also, did you
Version.
hear what he said? There are now different translations, not only in language, but in English. So the King James Version of the Hebrew Bible, which is what you're talking about, has a recognizable translation. It's not what you're saying. That may
Well,
be your interpretation.
No, it's not
And
an
there are other interpretations. What's the point?
The point was,
You like the King James Version?
the quotation you showed was misleading, I thought.
You mean,
Misleading.
in other words, it says something that you would wish would say something else.
Well, it
according to-
says something what the King James said.
You
The
can't
pre-
say it's misleading if there's
Well,
two
we'll
different
have to see
Well,
that.
translations, neither one of you speak the original language.
I guess the point I was making is that what we have is the present, and you're talking about history, and what Solomon was saying, what you have is the moment. And the moment is similar to Whitehead's process in reality, where you deal with entities and occasion and situations.
Well, you probably know Solomon better than I do.
Well, I know
I don't-
Whitehead
I
better than
don't
both
think
of you.
that- hang on a second. I think the quote that I used has to do with memory. And the meaning of the quote, as I understand it, is that people repeat and don't remember over time what they did. They don't learn, they don't remember, there's no remembrance. In my personal experience, I recognize that. It makes sense to me. So
Okay.
I would stand on the interpretation.
I got to go. Hang on 1 second. Read Proust. He answers both of these problems. I just want to remind everybody, as we're closing, sorry to cut you off, but this is a difficult problem to negotiate. In 1989, there was a book written called The End of History and the Last Man. It dominated political and neoliberal discourse. Everybody was talking about it. Very important book. It was almost important as the new book, Capital. In 1 year, it was wiped off the map by digital culture. So I think it's really interesting to read the book, to think about the book, and to see the effect of computers.
It wasn't wiped off the map by digital culture. It is not at all true. It was wiped off the map because the content was utterly fallacious.
Did I step all over your opening presentation? It's
you
just
did-
my ending.
That's not what happened.
I don't care.
But I do.
It's just my ending.
What the
I
end of
know.
history was followed by a war in Kuwait.
I know.
It didn't look like history had ended at all.
I know.
So it lost credence.
Anyway, forget it. Thanks for coming,
That's what
guys.
happened.